So, good morning, friends, and welcome back after a long gap to the online learning platform at Department of Civil Engineering, BMSIT. I'm Rajesh Gopinath, and you're along with me for the course on occupational health and safety. As you can recollect, in the previous session, we had an understanding with respect to development of fire, and we also understood further with respect to its severity. In today's presentation, we shall try to understand about EMP, that is Environmental Management Plan. The presentation has been phased out in the following manner, and finally, towards the end, I shall also give you a brief preview of ISO 14001, and I shall summarize and list the references for your kind perusal. Friends, let's try to have a brief understanding with respect to your Environmental Management Plan, or popularly as called as EMP. Friends, what we need to understand is, actually your environmental management plan is a tool, a management tool, or environmental management tool, okay, which is employed or it has been utilized in a specific purpose. And the purpose is to make sure that there are no adverse effects of any activity on the environment. Now, when I say adverse effects of the activity, now this activity can be connected to construction, operation, and decommissioning. So when I say operation, construction, decommissioning, okay, I am probably referring to industries or construction activities of huge buildings, or let us say commissioning and decommissioning of certain machineries or huge industrial belts. Okay, please understand the major objective, the major purpose of EMP is only to protect the environment, to enhance sustainability, to conserve the natural resources. And how does it do it? It does it so by making sure that if there are any negative impacts of any industrial activity or any activity as a matter of fact, those activities can be nullified or mitigated. At the same time, we know very well that development is also important for any nation. Industrialization is also important for any nation. So EMP is basically a management tool which tries to balance in such a manner that the adverse effects of the activity is removed and the positive impacts of the activity is enhanced. Please understand that there is no proper format or a standard format if somebody asks you to draft the EMP, because EMP will vary from location to location, industry to industry, scenario to scenario. So there is no standard format. However, the contents would remain more or less the same. And the holistic approach is always to make sure that when you have a plan to manage the environment, it should be sustainable. What we need to understand is, for a given scenario, situation, location, industry, when you go about preparing an environmental management plan, okay, we need to make sure that the plan that we prepare, the plan that we draft, it should be able to accommodate the circumstances and the requirements for which we are planning the EMP. Okay, now having said that, what would be the level of details? Now probably your EMP can be 1 page, 50 pages, 100 pages, or 500 pages. So the level of details that you need to prepare, that you need to provide in your EMP basically depends. It depends on the scale of your project. Is it a small scale industry, medium scale industry, or a large scale industry? It depends on, do you handle environmental risks, internal, external, indirect, direct, unpredictable, predictable? Okay, so based on the intensity of the operation, based on the intensity of the risks which are associated, the details leveling also would vary. But having said all this, please remember that eventually an environmental management plan which has been drafted would always serve to behave as a reference for similar industries, okay, in any other location or any other type of industry in the same location. Okay, now please remember that ISO 14001, we need to refer this document because it is this document which will provide the guidelines to the organizations, to the experts, to the government to develop, to review, to analyze, to criticize any environmental management plan which has been prepared. Okay, let's move further. So, what are the basic objectives of your environmental management plan? Friends, basically, when you speak about protecting the nature, protecting the environment, when you speak about enhancing the benefits of any industrial operation, whatever you speak, whatever you write, okay, everything has to be audited. Everything has to be feasible. It is not just the word of mouth wherein you say that, do not worry, I will take care of the environment. Do not worry, I shall take care of the safety of my workers. Anything that you say has to be feasible. Anything that you say has to be auditable. So any commitment which is made by the occupant, made by the industrialist, made by the safety manager, made by the EHS manager, everything has to be practical. Okay, now it has to be practical, it should be feasible, and we should be able to audit it because we need to ensure that whatever commitments have been made, they have been achieved or not. Please understand, whenever we speak about environmental management plan, it is basically not an individual plan, it is a strategic integrated plan. As you know, in an industry there are different shop floors. In an industry there are different kind of machineries, different kind of operations. Everything comes with different timelines and different kind of hazards. So environmental management plan has to accommodate and envisage all these facets. Therefore, it's an integrated plan. And why do you have this integrated plan? So that you can carry out a comprehensive monitoring. And only if you do a comprehensive monitoring, my dear friends, we can control the impacts, the negative impacts that the project may have. Please understand, when you have a very good EMP, it is easy to convince, okay, the society around you. It is easy to convince the workers who are employed under you about the safety, about the environment, and the feasibility of your project. Please understand, only if you do an environmental management plan, only if you draft it, we will actually get to know what are the attributes which are going to be impacted. In other words, my dear friends, EMP actually helps you to identify EPI, environmental performance indicators. Okay, please understand, without having identified this, a project cannot be initiated, because without knowing which environmental parameter will be impacted, if you continue to do the operation, when the damage occurs, it would have been too late. Please understand that EMP is also about documentation. Now, documentation which includes procedures, which includes methods, documentation which speaks about the expert who has framed it, the analyst who has reviewed it, the government official who has approved it. Documentation which speaks about what are the operations in your industry, what are the activities during construction, what are the environmental parameters being impacted. Documentation also speaks about what would be the problem if you continue your operations, if you continue your activities, which all parameter will be impacted and by how much. Documentation also includes how do you go about mitigating these impacts, what are the alternatives that you have suggested, what are the control measures that you have suggested. Documentation also involves monitoring reports, follow-up reports. In other words, my dear friends, the major objective of EMP is to ensure that your EMP is accountable. Only then your monitoring plan will be effective. And more or less, let's also understand that environment and development has to go hand in hand. So productivity is also important, profit is also important. To be very honest, if you draft a proper EMP, industrialists will easily get to know what would be the investment and return on investment for a particular activity, whether it is feasible to carry out the activity or not, which is a technology which will help me to enhance my profit, at the same time making sure that the pollution is reduced, which is a technology that I have to bring in, wherein the safety of my workers are not compromised, therefore absenteeism is reduced. So these are few of the objectives of environmental management plan, wherein by default, when you conserve nature, when you protect the environment, invariably, inadvertently, you also would be focusing upon the safety of the workers. Now, what are the core principles with respect to which your EMP works? Please understand, it's always about commitment towards environment. The way an industrialist is committed towards profit, the industrialist, the safety manager, the environmental manager, the EHS manager must also be committed towards a sustainable environment. The commitment is very important. Otherwise, the entire backbone of your EMP will collapse. Also, we need to understand that the scenario keeps on changing. There are new technologies, new hazards, new environmental concerns. So your EMP should be drafted in such a manner that it is flexible and also responsive with respect to changes. And most importantly, any EMP which is drafted, there should be an integration among all the operations in the industry, across all the shop floors, across all the workers. And finally, why are we doing all this? So that there is continuous improvement. For example, if we are talking about a safety management plan in an industry, the objective is to make sure that we are able to reduce the accidents from day 1 to day X, and we see a day wherein there are no accidents at all. In similar words, environmental management plan focuses to ensure that whatever damages or pollution is happening towards environment, it is reduced to such an extent as the day progresses. Therein, finally, there is a day when you do not cause any environmental issues. Okay, now let's move to the next slide. Please remember, just like safety of any worker can be compromised during the construction phase, during the operation phase, during the decommissioning phase, similarly, there are environmental parameters which can be impacted during construction phase and also during the operation phase. For example, let us speak about an industry, say thermal power plants. Now, you know very well that in thermal power plants, we speak about burning coal. So, in the operation phase, it is air pollution which becomes a concern. But in the construction phase, you might be talking about deforestation. Okay, you might be talking about, removal of topsoil. So there are so many environmental issues which can be connected before the industry starts working, during the construction phase, and of course, as the industry continues to operate. So you can see a sample here wherein when I draft an environmental management plan for any activity, any industry, okay, during construction phase, I have to make sure that I identify every component that could be impacted. Now, what you need to understand is, depending on the activities, depending on the location, depending on the scale of activity, depending on the scenario, okay, some of these components may be connected, may not be connected. First point. The second point, some of these components may be adversely impacted when compared to the other components, and this may not be the case when you talk about other industries in other locations or same industry in a different location. So in an environmental management plan, we need to foremost identify which are the environmental parameters which could be impacted. Let us say, for example, groundwater level or the quality of water near in the lake or the river near you, or probably the topsoil, the fertility aspect, or probably the health of the worker during the construction phase, or probably the amount of pollution via noise or air. Okay, so once you identified this, the next step is in your EMP, you have to go about identifying or devising, okay, or planning. How can I reduce these impacts? How can I nullify these impacts? And by saying so, within what time frame it is applicable? Sometimes, the environmental attribute can be impacted throughout the operation. Maybe sometime it will be impacted only when the construction takes place. Okay, once you identified that, you need to tag a person, a individual who is responsible to handle this issue. It can be a supervisor, it can be a OHS manager, it can be a safety engineer, and so forth. Similar concept, similar logic also applies for operation. Please understand, construction is an activity which commences and which concludes after a specific duration, but operation is an activity which continues. Now, you know that different industries have different kind of credibilities. Some industries work throughout the day, some industries work only during some particular seasons. Okay, now having said that, the EMP will vary from industry to industry. Some industries use water as a raw material, some industries use water only for housekeeping attributes, some industries need fresh air. Let us say electronics industries, raw air, fresh air, okay, is basically required in the pristine form as a raw material. But some industries, on the other hand, does not require air as a raw material, but rather it pollutes the air. So every industry comes in different packages, and all of them have to be identified, have to be handled individually and respectively. Okay, now what are the different aspects? Now this is more or less a recap. So friends, any industry, okay, whether you are talking about operation or construction, these are the various parameters or aspects that have to be looked upon. Say water, when I say water, it could be quantitative, qualitative. Probably the depth of water in your groundwater, okay, or the quantity of water which is there in your lake, or quality of groundwater, quality of your lake water. Please understand, activities can impact both the ways. Your industry can suck all the groundwater and reduce the water table. At the same time, your industry can contaminate the groundwater also. Okay, now let's speak about air. Now, air has various parameters. Now, let us say your industry releases more and more of carbon dioxide. Now, that's a global concern because you know that carbon dioxide elevation leads to global warming. However, the industry can also release sulfur dioxide, which causes acid rain, or it may release carbon monoxide, which is not good for the human health. So, friends, all these aspects that you see here, okay, can be impacted quantitatively and qualitatively by any activity. And having said that, it could be construction phase, it could be operation phase, it could be decommissioning phase. Now you might ask me, how come decommissioning matters? Now if you talk about mining operation, mining is one activity which can impact the environment during the construction phase, during the operation phase, and even after the mine has been shut down, whether it is your KGF, okay, even after it is shut down, it continues to pollute the environment. Okay. Now, having said and having spoken about the environmental attributes, yes, we also need to understand that there are employees, there are workers who are working in your factory, in your industry, their health, in terms of hygiene, okay, and also probably the probability rate of accidents, they also need to be undertaken, they also need to be understood when you speak about an environmental management plan. Please remember that air pollution is not just going to affect the society or the people outside the factory, it will also affect the worker inside the factory. So by handling air pollution, you're protecting not just the people outside the factory, but the worker inside factory. Therefore, it is directly connected to the well-being, to the safety of the worker. And therefore, you can reduce absenteeism and enhance your productivity. All right. Now, so what are the various steps, how you can go about implementing your environmental management plan? Friends, first and foremost, we need to specify the requirements. Okay, and when I say requirements, I am talking in the context of training and environmental awareness. Please understand, every stakeholder who is connected has to be trained. They have to be made aware of the environmental aspects. Only then you will be working in the holistic approach. We also need to understand, with respect to document handling, okay, because if you do not stipulate the document handling and control system, then the entire EMP documentation process will collapse. You also need to have in place a procedure. The procedure with respect to reporting, with respect to protocols, with respect to hierarchy. And this reporting can be under normal circumstances. This reporting can also be during emergency. Okay, say in the event of a fire breakout. So who reports to whom? And which team is going to be active, who speaks to media, who contacts the government, who contacts the fire department, who informs the emergency response team, who informs the fire brigade. And another important step when it comes to your EMP is to carry out audit. You must carry out audit to understand whether there is compliance or non-compliance. The audit has to be carried out to make sure whether the industry is undertaking all the correct measures to protect the worker, to protect environment, and to prevent depletion of any resources. Okay, because in case if there's a non-compliance, then a suitable action would be taken as legally bound by the norms of the country. Okay. Now, please understand, there are various types of stakeholders when it comes to any activity. You can have contractors, you can have subcontractors. Okay, so everyone has to be engaged when it comes to your EMP, because everyone should be in line. Okay, everyone should toe in line to understand that the primary concern is always the protection of environment. And in case of the need arises, the EMP requirements can be transferred, okay, to the contractor, the subcontractor, or any other party. But all this will happen through the legal standing itself, because please understand that any accident which takes place, any environmental pollution that takes place, any incident, any accident which occurs, okay, will have legal bearing, legal implications on every stakeholder, every party which is involved with the industry itself. Okay, and finally, yes, it is always the management who is answerable. It is the management who is the scapegoat, because it is his or her major responsibility to make sure that everything works well. So management is also obliged. So one of the important steps in EMP is to carry a management review, wherein the highest authority will review it. Now this review can happen through internal parties, or it can happen through external parties. Now friends, these are some simple templates which are part of EMP, wherein data is collected. And the advantage of having these templates and this data collection is because you can always compare them, you can review them, you can analyze them, and this is the data which has to be provided during the documentation process. This is the data which has to be maintained in the departments or shops, or shop floors rather. Now, let's come to the other part. Remember, I told you it is ISO 14001, which is basically providing the guidelines, okay, to draft the environmental management plan. Friends, basically your ISO 14001 is an international standard, and it is this standard which specifies the requirements for having an effective environmental management system. So, as an industrialist, as an organization, if you're working towards drafting a EMP, if you're committed to protecting an environment, then you would obviously have in place what is called as environmental health and safety system, okay, or probably you would have something called as environmental management system. And to have an effective EMS, you need to probably refer ISO 14001. In simple words, this ISO 14001, it provides a framework which any organization can follow, okay? Please understand, it's a guideline, it's a reference. Now, what you also need to understand is this is a voluntary standard. There is no compulsion. There is no compulsion that you need to go for that. But having said that, if you voluntarily accept this, if you are doing that, then your bearing on the environment would help you with respect to the branding. So having an ISO certification, okay, and depending on what certification you have, if you still have an outdated certification or if you have the latest certification, it would definitely improve the morale and your image in the company, in the market. In fact, having an ISO certification would also, alter the market dynamics, wherein every buyer would obviously go for something which has been certified with the international standards. Let us say you talk about India, we're talking about the Bureau of Indian Standards. Basically, what happens is having the ISO 14001, let us say in this context of environmental management system, it is ISO 14001 2015. I'm talking about the revised version, of course. Okay, this can be used by any organization. All right. And why do they do that? Wherein they think about protecting the environment. One of their organizational goals is conserving environment and therefore having a very good clean image in front of the public, in front of the government. Having an EMS also helps you to prepare or draft the environmental policy. And it is this policy which is visible to all stakeholders. This policy will showcase your commitment to environment. Okay, and having a ISO certification, okay, it also shows what kind of standards you're following. But please understand that. Having said this, lot of activities, lot of improvisations, lot of corrective and preventive measures must be in place. New technologies must be in place so that you can match up to the standards. Only if you comply with all the requirements, only then the certification is given to you. Of course, now depending on the size of the industry, location of the industry, what type of industry you are, what scale of the industry, the certifications of course would vary. But having said this, ultimately what does ISO 14001 do? It helps you to identify the environmental parameters which will be impacted because of your activity. It will try to tell you, okay, whether you are being compliant with the obligations which are set up by the government. Let's say Ministry of Environment and Forest, or let's say Central Pollution Control Board, or let's say the State Pollution Control Board. Are you complying with them? What should you do to be compliant with them? And finally, my dear friends, all this that we are doing is only for one goal: continuous improvement, wherein you strive to continually improve so that the environment is protected and the safety of every individual who are part of the environment is also conserved. There is a particular process called as PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. Okay, this is the core of your environmental management system. Please understand, ISO 14001, is not a compulsion on every organization. Voluntarily, if you take it up, there are so many benefits. Benefits not only in terms of protecting the environment, benefit in terms of reducing the cost on waste management, reducing the cost in terms of pollution. Because having an EMS, having an EMP will tell you how to handle the waste, how to reduce the waste. Can I do reduce, recover, recycle? All these critical inputs are given to you if you are ready to adopt a EMP, if you're ready to frame an environmental policy. In other words, if you're ready to have an environmental management system in your organization. And having said this, let me tell you, it is going to improve the morale of every individual who is connected and associated with your industry. It can be the safety manager, it can be the worker, it can be the public. Okay, it can be a buyer, it can be a seller, it can be a contractor, it can be a subcontractor, but eventually all of them would have a goodwill. All of them are connected to you. All of them will have, a prospective, positive approach and outlook towards your industry. And that definitely matters when you speak about market dynamics and competition in market. You will be way ahead of others, especially in this era wherein environment is a major concern. If you project yourself as an environmental friendly company, you will always be ahead of other competitors. Now friends, what have we understood so far? We have understood that, basically your environmental management plan is a very simple tool which describes how an action of your operation or a construction phase can impact the environment and how you can go about ensuring that such a damage doesn't take place. It is a manner in which you identify certain stakeholders. You have a commitment towards protecting environment. Eventually, finally, whatever activity you do, irrespective of construction phase, operation phase, or decommissioning phase, whatever you do, it is acceptable, it is feasible in the context of environmental protection, environmental conservation. And not just that, it saves a lot of money for you because you would not enter into any legal disputes, and you will be saving a lot of money when it comes to the waste handling or pollution mitigation. So it is basically like a reference. And I would like to end this presentation by telling you one thing. See, basically your environmental management plan is a site-specific plan. A site-specific plan which has been developed to make sure that any project, any activity which is implemented, it is carried out in an environmentally sustainable, friendly manner. My dear friends, this need not just apply to large industries or small scale industries. Right within your house, within your four walls, you can also develop an environmental management plan, because to be very honest, your activities inside your house can also cause environmental issues. Your activities can also lead to endangering the health, compromising the hygiene and the safety of individuals inside a house. So what I would request you is, as a self-study, I would ask all of you to explore, if I want to develop a EMP for my household activities, how do I go about? Very simple. First, identify what are the environmental attributes which are being impacted because of the activities which happen day to day, and how can I go about handling them? How can I go about making sure that my activities do not endanger the environment? Probably today, after a couple of days that the World Environment Day has passed, I think this should be one interesting activity which all of you should voluntarily take to set an example that you are way ahead, okay, among all the residents in being environmentally friendly. Please understand, segregation of waste, dry waste, wet waste, it is also one essential activity which you can carry out, and so forth. So my dear friends, now these are the references for a kind perusal, and for the next class we shall be entering into the world of personal protective equipments.